Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In connection with national debt, it is usually pointed out that future generations will have to pay for it. In reality, planners use debt to steal businesses and citizens of the resources that are financed by that debt. On top of that, all generations will have to pay interest, which in Germany's case will be higher than the amount of debt itself. In this video, I will explain why this is the case. This video is based on the situation in Germany, but many characteristics of public debt apply everywhere. A brief look at the debt package. The two main topics. First, the process of a sensible loan procedure. Here we take a closer look at what loan repayment means. Second, public debt. This concerns the consequences of massive money creation. Following this, a look at the reality of debt in connection with productivity growth, as well as the debt package in connection with the current economic and political situation in Germany. A massive debt package is planned. Over 1 trillion euros for federal, state and local governments, spread across 12 years. The funds are intended for defense, infrastructure, climate protection, education and NGOs, and indirectly for social benefits that can no longer be financed without new debt. To clarify what is meant, let's start with an example of a meaningful credit process using a manufacturer. Let's look at a practical case. A manufacturer of small specialty vehicles is struggling with sales. To recover, it takes out a 50 million euros loan to restore profitability. But where do the funds and resources for such a loan really come from? The gross domestic product, the GDP, reflects market activities. From the author's perspective, the market is the place where value is created. Followers of the Austrian School of Economics see it as the place where market prices are formed. Regardless of these views, GDP represents the economic exchange processes in society, and thus the space where credit and debt money take effect. We represent GDP with a dark blue bar. It marks the boundary of the economy where credit operates. To keep things simple, we'll work with a GDP of 4 trillion euros, close to the real value. The goods and services that make up GDP are consumed using monetary resources. The GDP of 4 trillion euros reflects the total value of goods and services produced and consumed. This output is necessarily matched by a money supply of 4 trillion euros, represented here by a light blue bar. The GDP, valued at 4 trillion euros in market prices, is automatically matched by a money supply of 4 trillion euros via those same market prices, loosely based on the Austrian School of Economics. GDP data always reflects the past and carries the hope that future output will at least remain stable. But how does credit actually affect the economy? The bank, which the entrepreneur turns to, creates money, in this case nearly 50 million euros. Money represents a right to a percentage share of all goods subject to economic exchange. In this case, the bank provides the vehicle manufacturer with the requested credit. Yet the money granted to the manufacturer is not backed by tangible goods, services or gold. The bank merely adds a small reserve to support the credit. This money is added to the overall money supply and acts as a claim on goods from the same economic pool as all other money. The entrepreneur uses uncovered credit money to access the goods and services from the existing pool. It can also include goods and services that have not been used until then. The quantity of goods will not be increased by more money in circulation. Through his productive activity, he covers the credit money with goods from this existing pool. He uses the funds to improve and expand his products and production, represented here by a larger building. However, the portion of goods accessed by the entrepreneur is no longer available to other companies and citizens within the currency area. Note: if additional credit money were always matched by additional goods and services, there would be no scarcity on earth, nor would debt-based money lead to price increases. The amount of money in circulation is not the true limit to a country's productive capacity. However, credit can expand a society's supply of goods and services by increasing productivity. Let's now take a closer look at credit utilization and credit repayment. The entrepreneur modified the vehicles and the production technology and expanded overall output. He used the credit-based resources productively, generating value for himself and ultimately for society. His profit increased significantly to well over 52.5 million euros over the loan period as a result of these changes alone, enabling him to repay the loan and interest as well as securing additional lasting revenue. By repaying the credit from the results of its use, the entrepreneur automatically returns the borrowed amount of resources to society. The money he repays is visually linked via a connector between the repayment arrow to the bank and the goods and services arrow to GDP, representing his claim to exactly that amount of goods. He can't print money like a bank. He must earn it by producing and selling goods. That's what backs his money. By repaying the credit, he also relinquishes his claim to the corresponding amount of goods worth 50 million euros. He fills the gap created by the borrowed resources through productive repayment. He lifts the burden, returning what he once drew from society. The bank now withdraws the money from circulation. Together they restore the initial state in terms of money supply and goods volume as it was before the credit was issued. Additionally, the entrepreneur pays interest to the bank as compensation for the service, which includes the risk of default. What the entrepreneur permanently earns beyond credit repayment and interest, he uses for himself for taxes, contributions, investments and other purposes. Through sustainably increased production and higher sales, the entrepreneur raises society's GDP, shown here as a narrow dark blue bar. To ensure this additional volume of goods can be consumed without arbitrarily reducing consumption of other goods, the central bank, respectively European Central Bank, must issue the necessary money into circulation. This is how credit should typically be used in productive sectors. Note: in reality, such an additional amount of money would be lost in the noise and would not even be noticed by the European Central Bank. On the following slides, we'll examine the public debt mechanism in 3 steps, with further details. The debt mechanism for federal, state and local governments. For simplicity, we'll again assume a gross domestic product of 4 trillion euros. This GDP is held constant over a 12-year period, so in reality it's more likely to decline. The amount of money used is always automatically equal to the value assigned to goods and services in GDP. That is the sum of their market prices. GDP reflects what can be achieved under current technical and societal conditions, regardless of whether 4, 3 or 5 trillion euros is assigned to it. 4 trillion euros is the current monetary expression of this performance capacity, which is economic and societal but not determined by money itself. More money in circulation does not increase this capacity. Note: the ECB's target annual inflation rate of 2% is omitted for the sake of clarity. The economic performance of a country cannot simply be increased by investing more money. This insight was already formulated in 1911 by Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. In his work, The Theory of Economic Development, he described how economic progress occurs in waves. With the rise of mechanical loom, large sums were invested in looms, until profits declined and aligned with returns in other sectors. Further large-scale investments reached a point of diminishing returns and no longer paid off, either because they couldn't be refinanced or because profits were too low compared to other opportunities. Further investment in technologies whose marginal utility has been reached in the given environment would require subsidizing production through other activities. This in turn would create zombie sectors or entire zombie companies, burdening the economy elsewhere, or bankruptcies would have to be declared. Back to technological evolution. The same pattern occurred with the steam engine, the railway, cars with gas engine and the first cars with electric motors, the propeller aircraft, and so on. Some older technologies disappear entirely. Others remain useful and are maintained with incremental improvements. Some continue in niche applications. Investing more money without innovation simply leads to sinking more funds. Entrepreneurs and potential investors are actively seeking investment opportunities. If they can't find anything profitable, there's a very high probability that centrally planned investments would simply waste that money. Even if investments were to be made in infrastructure, for instance in high load-bearing bridges for the heavy industry, if this industry is driven into insolvency or pushed abroad, such investments will not generate compensating profits. They won't cover the damage caused by debt, nor the interest payments, nor the repayment of the loans. The same possible apply to investments in new technologies. Take AI, for example, which requires large energy-intensive data centers. Success is questionable if energy prices are far above global market levels, power supply is unstable, bureaucratic hurdles make setup and operation significantly more expensive than abroad, conditions for skilled workers deteriorate through taxes, levies, housing, healthcare, mobility and more, and foreign competitors offer similar services at much lower prices. Let's return to the topic of debt. Over a period of 12 years, the federal government has taken on debt amounting to 1 trillion euros through various channels, which are summarized here. The funds are added to the national budget via federal bonds and loans, and are then allocated to support programs justified by economic and ideological reasoning. The borrowed funds are distributed to beneficiaries, those who are to be subsidized through the debt. This money is, as in the previous example, added to the total money supply, which is placed in opposite to the quantity of goods as an equivalent. As previously mentioned, the money is intended to flow into areas such as defense and climate projects. However, it is now becoming clear that a significant portion is being used to plug holes in the federal budget. The loan from banks isn't covered by goods. The money used from savings deposits or other financial service providers is also no equivalent of goods and services of the GDP before it is used. The money from savings accounts is usually already invested. As soon as those subsidized through the additional money supply begin to use these funds, they draw goods and services from the existing pool. In other words, the debt money becomes covered through its use. In doing so, the subsidized parties realize the claims to scarce goods symbolized by the money, claims that were not earned through performance but merely asserted. With this money, they essentially borrow a quantity of resources, just as they borrow the money itself. The total volume of goods is not increased, at least not in the short term. The use of debt funds triggers additional demand for goods, which in turn drives up prices, initially for those goods that are in particularly high demand. In some cases, prices begin to form for goods that previously had not been utilized at all. Through the complex interaction of all economic sectors via the market, price increases are passed on. Wage increases are demanded or implemented, which in turn lead to further price increases, and so on, until all debt funds for the respective time period have been used. This process continues until ultimately the total sum of market prices reaches 5 trillion euros. More debt money means higher assigned values and rising market prices for the same goods and services. Here is the new value assignment, a total market price of 5 trillion euros. As the volume of goods and services remains constant, each unit of money now claims less. Prices rise to reflect the new volume of money, a visible price inflation effect. Increasingly, real inflation is triggered, a surplus of purchasing power over available goods and services. Subsidized groups use the extra funds to consume 20% of the total goods. That portion, 1/5 of all goods, is no longer available to those without subsidies. The lower section illustrates this effect. Here we see businesses and individuals visualized with profits and incomes. Light blue bars indicate pre-redistribution money usage. Dark blue bars reflect the corresponding consumption. First, a look at the situation before the distribution of debt money. The shaded sections reveal what the non-subsidized lose as a result of debt-driven redistribution. What non-subsidized companies and citizens lose, 1/5 of their earned claims, is consumed by the subsidized alone, who hold the necessary funds. In this way, in addition to high energy costs, taxes, levies, and bureaucratic expenses, companies are having more resources stolen for product development, investment, training, takeover defenses, and so on, while citizens having even more resources stolen for their lives and future. The country's innovative capacity and economic strengths are steadily diminished. Germany is becoming increasingly unattractive to businesses and high achievers. Non-subsidized companies and citizens end up financing the goods consumed by the subsidized. Those receiving subsidies are borrowing this amount of resources just as they previously borrowed the money to acquire them. The promise to return the money and thus the borrowed resources cannot be taken seriously. How we will see later, the repayment won't start for more than 200 years, because legacy debts must be cleared first. Interest payments and repayments would have to come solely from debt-based gains. Otherwise, future taxes would have to use to cover the shortfall. But even that wouldn't suffice for reparation. The new debt is already causing serious damage today, how we have seen already. Debt advocates paint completely different views. The debt will be invested and economic power will increase. The infrastructure will be improved and everything will run faster and better. Schools will be renovated and new high-performing employees will be available for businesses. The armed forces will be made capable of defending our country, etc., so that the economy will flourish and the debt can be repaid without problems. The following will show that the likelihood of debt-financed misinvestment is very high. This chart shows, despite rising debt since 2007, productivity hasn't improved. The data suggest borrowing went into spending, not into investments. So it's likely this path will continue. There is clearly no effective control over how debt money is spent and what it delivers. The Bund der Steuerzahler, Germany's Taxpayers Association, did the math. If we paid back 1 billion euros per month, starting now, we'd be debt-free by 2235. So the interest costs exceed the debt. That makes it nearly impossible to present a clear repayment plan as required by the Constitution. What does Germany's debt environment look like? Investment requires an investment-friendly environment, but Germany is increasingly shaping one that resembles East Germany, the former GDR. Current economic policy is driven primarily by ideology, not by economic logic. Interventionism initially leads to forced value creation or forced market prices in some areas. Due to the complex interconnectedness of economic processes, these market prices are distributed. Thus, after a short time, it becomes impossible to determine how effectively, efficiently, and resource-conserving things are produced and used, as was once the case in East Germany, the GDR. With an increasingly extensive centrally planned economy, classic inflation has been spread throughout all federal states of Germany now. This excess of money compared to the supply of goods and services, with other words, this shortage economy, is particularly noticeable in the housing market and in childcare. For centrally planned projects, as well as for the increasing control of society, the administration, this means the bureaucracy, must be continually expanded. For control purposes, but also because the market does not demonstrate how effectively these areas operate. Furthermore, this leads to zombie areas. Businesses and citizens are being massively burdened. With ever-increasing debts, more and more goods are stolen from them. Furthermore, they cannot receive tax relief because ever-increasing interest payments are incurred and ever further burdens are generated. Very high energy, social and bureaucratic costs, all mainly due to ideology. High taxes and levies, largely ideologically driven, including a flawed immigration policy, contribute to this. Citizens pay over 50% to the state. An environment unfriendly to businesses and citizens was created. More companies and top performers are being pushed out of the country, while more unskilled people are being lured in. More and more companies are being driven into bankruptcy. Germany is suffering a massive loss of technology and know-how. Under the conditions described here, even the full use of debt funds for investments would not be sensible, because future profits, if they exist, from these funds would not be enough to pay off these debts, compensate for the damage caused, or finance the interest payments. Conclusion. New debt hits current businesses and citizens first. They are footing the bill before anyone else. Relaxing the debt brake means making debt-funded resource shifts a permanent fixture, away from companies and citizens toward the subsidized. Future generations will repay the debt a second time, well over 200 years from now. Across generations, interest payments exceed the debt, flowing steadily to banks and other lenders. This way, the debt are paid more than 3 times. An ideology-driven policy will also primarily use new debt on an ideological basis. This and the resulting central planning bypasses market mechanisms, leaves important information unused, and leads the economy towards ineffectiveness, inefficiency, and resource waste, that means into decline. The repayment of the debts and the interest payments will not be possible from potential profits based on the debts-financed investments. Using new debt under current conditions would have catastrophic consequences. The state is an ineffective, inefficient, and resource-wasting entrepreneur. So what must happen now? No more debt, full stop. Massive savings are needed. There must be no loosening of the debt brake, none at all. The media must report openly on the problems caused by debt.